Hi everyone, my name's Isaiah Ratterman. Welcome to the pastel corner of my studio. So what I'm going to do today is give a kind of a little demo lecture of how I go about pastels and my process with them. So to give you a little information about me, I am a full-time artist. This is what I do nowadays. I taught as a professor for quite a few years, and then recently I've transitioned just studio time, which has been fantastic. Um, this demo slash lecture I'm going to give, it's going to be to the same kind of degree and premise that what I would do in an intro to pastel course. It's going to kind of get you comfortable with the ideas, the techniques, and the materials, and hopefully, help you on your journey with pastels. So, to start, uh, let's look at materials here. Um, so the first thing I want to talk about is the actual substrate which you're going to be working on. There's a variety and a million different ways to go about this. The big thing I would say is just play, see what materials you like, what works for the technique you like. Just like anything in the arts, there's a million ways and a million different techniques you can practice, and it's just a matter of seeing what you're kind of drawn to and what works best. So what I do is I work on a sanded paper, and I work on a really fine grit sanded paper. So this paper is mounted to a foam core, and it's all an archival acid-free foam core, archival acid-free hot press to that paper. And you want your work to stand the test of time. So whatever you do, make sure that the materials and the quality at which you're working on are up to par, and they will stand the test of time. As far as drawing substrates, there's other things, like you can actually get like hardboard laminated sandpaper, pastel sandpaper, and I was never really happy with the grit on those. I think this is about an 800 grit sandpaper. There's also really heavy grit sandpapers, or even more fine than this. This is just what I found over the years to kind of lend itself to the pastels I work with and the techniques I do. Some people love a heavier sandpaper, heavier grit. For me, it eats the pastels up a bit too much. Any finer than this, the pastels won't adhere. The way pastels work, they're a loose medium in the sense that they don't bond and dry like paint. They constantly will stay dry over their lifetime. They don't just magically adhere to themselves and become a unified surface. So with that, substrate and adhesion to it is really important. Think of it like that paper has little teeth and little grits, and that pastel dust gets inside those little pockets, and that's how it holds. You can also work on just simple paper. It doesn't have to be a sandpaper. The way I got into pastels is after high school, I started doing a lot of life drawing. I really wanted to get better at the anatomy and form of the human body. It's just one of the most I don't even know how to describe it. It trained me more than anything else did. There's nothing harder than the complexities of hard mass or soft mass over hard mass, and those forms that shift as you draw, because they're not statues. So as a side note, I'd really recommend life drawing. It's just a wonderful practice for an artist, especially if you are drawn towards a more naturalistic approach in realism. So, I started drawing on cold pressed paper. I think Rives BFK, and that's just a heavyweight cold pressed paper. Nothing special to it. It's not sanded or anything like this. So there's a lot of options out there, and just feel it out. See which one's good for you. So the next is the actual idea of the pastel. So pastels, just like papers, there's tons of different options. I work with soft pastels. There's hard pastels like Prismacolor's new pastels. Those are closer to almost like a chalk crown mix. Then what I speak to when I talk about pastels is the buttery quality. I like really soft pastels. I started drawing with Rembrandt pastels, and those are a pretty good soft pastel. And then over the years I found Ludwig's, and I just haven't gone anywhere else since. They're fantastic. They've got this really buttery movement to them on their touch. They stick to themselves really well, and you can build the pastel up fairly well with those. I would just highly recommend them. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that. Don't get that idea. I am lucky enough to be in Denver though, and they have they're located not too far away. So I've had the pleasure of going in there, getting to meet the owner and the staff, and they're just wonderful people, and I couldn't speak any more highly of that brand. If you are in Denver, go check them out. It's a good time. So, with this, the next thing I want to talk about is the pastel setup. I'm in my studio, so I've got my little world contained. It's a ideal working space for me. I've got good lighting overhead. I've actually got this guy back here. That's an air purifier, and then this little box down here that you can see, right there. This is actually a secondary air purifier that creates a downpool. So any pastel dust goes to that, and then there's another one of these connected to it that blows that clean air out. The reason why I'm so big on air quality in the studio is because I've only got one body. I want to take care of it. And second to that, I'm an oil painter as well. And so over there, I've got my oil paints, and if those are wet, pastel dust in the air normally isn't a good thing on my end. So twofold, just make sure that when you're working with materials, you're safe, you're taking care of yourself. And it's a little bit easier if you've got a bigger studio space. You're not, my ceiling's only normal 7.5 foot tall. It's really not a big area. Okay, as I get set up with pastels, I'm going to kind of go through things almost in a drawing one fashion, and then we're going to progress into the materials and the techniques of pastels themselves. The reason why I want to go over drawing, because, well, you got to be able to have a good mindset. Pastels, painting, they're built on the foundation of a lot of the techniques of what drawing handles. So the thing I like to tell people is, especially my students, is that when you draw, drawing doesn't come from the wrist. Detail comes from the wrist. Actual drawing, it comes from the shoulder. The reason for that is, people tend to get really tight on detail and want to work with the wrist versus that big movement you can get out of your shoulder. I want you standing up. The reason, if you're physically capable, if you're not, perfectly fine, sit down obviously. But standing up, it frees you and makes you move that shoulder more than sitting down. That's the big reason for that one. And also, standing up allows you to more easily get back from the drawing surface. You don't want to be up on it with your head right in the board, because then you're not going to see the whole picture, especially if you're working on a larger piece. You want to be able to see the picture plane. You want to be able to get those big movements. Details come secondary to big movements within artwork. If you nail the big details, it's going to be a far superior piece of artwork than anything with the most pristine details possible. Now put those two together and it's the perfect marriage. But start with big details, big shapes, big forms first, and then once those are locked in, you transition to the details. With pastels, there's a unique quality to them when I get set up, in the sense that they create a lot of extra material that falls off as you work, especially as you work heavier into them. So, my setup, I don't know if you can see this, well, you can't see that. This drawing is actually leaning towards me, probably on 5 to 10 degree tilt. It's not enough to cause distortion in my drawing plane, but what happens is, as you work with pastels, those pastels are going to slough material off. So if I have a really dark area down here, and I'm drawing a really light area, that light pastel dust is going to touch the dark, and it's going to create this annoying snow, kind of like strippling effect through there. So to keep the areas pristine, get it on a back tilt, keep that dust from falling on the surface itself. Okay, so from here, let's see. I'm lucky enough to have purchased the whole set of Ludwig, so I've got like 300 plus pastel blocks to work with. The little pastel blocks look like that. So I've got a wide assortment. But the thing is, I typically only use a very limited palette when I work. The reason for that is that it gives me the ability to really let those pastels intermix and create secondary tonal shifts inside of there, versus if I were to try to like gradate with every pastel block. The beauty of pastels for me is how quickly you can get intensities of color that pop. As an oil painter, if I tried to work as quickly with and get the intensities that I do out of pastels, what would happen is I'd end up with mud. So they're just a different kind of medium for their efficiency and just beautiful mixing and high chroma saturation qualities. So I've always found it easier to start with high chroma, high saturation colors because they will mute themselves down as they mix through. All right, so I've got my workstation set up. I've got a few different colors set up across here. I've got a few neutrals, a few different prismatic ranges. I might pull one or two, but 10's probably all I'm going to need for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with I'm going to do a demonstration on koi. I found koi as a subject matter in grad school. What happened was I came from Ohio, that's where I'm originally from. I got to Philadelphia, and I'd never been in a big city, much less lived in one. And it was pretty overwhelming because it was all concrete, and I wasn't used to it, and so I just wanted to get a break. And Philadelphia has these beautiful park spaces, and they've got a just gorgeous Japanese house. So, it became this little escape, and then I thought they were a great subject matter. I started drawing them, painting them, got more invested in them. People liked them. The galleries wanted them, and then it just snowballed from there. The thing I like about koi as a subject matter is there's a freedom to them. If you do portraiture, which I do, and it's great and it's wonderful, if you're off by 1/8 of an inch on an eyeball, person looks crazy. With koi, you have all these fun little aspects like water ripples, water reflections and refractions and distortions. So there's much more freedom to that movement without it feeling just off. And then out of that, they're also a beautiful, beautiful color theory study in the sense that they're these high chroma, high saturation beings, animals, and then they exist on these kind of neutrally, watery surfaces that typically are grays and greens. But there's a depth to them, so you have surface reflections, depth of form below the water, water distortions and ripples, the glowing effect that happens from that light hitting the koi and emanating outwards and kind of illuminating the water next to it. So they're a technical thing that never gets boring for me. So that's what I'm going to do a demonstration on. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go get a glass of water real quick, and then we're going to start in on a demo. Okay, all set up, good to go. Side note, if you do have water in your studio when you're working, put a little piece of paper on top of it. Like I said, pastel dust goes places. Probably don't want to drink that. It will get in your water glass. All right. So to begin with, how I like to think of this is going to be a study. I'm not going to think of it as a formalized composition end to end. I really just want to focus on the form of the koi and just kind of play and think about the color studies that could happen, the forms of the water. Whatever you do, first and foremost, I think it's important that you are extremely familiar with the subject that you're creating. Know the internal forms, the structures of it, the external forms. That should be your goal. I'm a big fan of working from life, and there's a reason why it's a time-honored tradition within the arts. It teaches you more than anything else possibly can. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with working from photographic, resource photos, or photographs as resources. The issue with that when you first start out, though, that I have found with students is that a photograph, it takes a three-dimensional plane and makes it into a two-dimensional plane. So your brain doesn't have to do that. You don't have to learn to sight the object, scale it, place it, transfix it onto the area that you're working with. There's just, if you really want to learn how to see, draw from life. But there are instances when you need photographic resources, and what I like to say is think of it like a waterfall effect. That what you want to do is you want to start from life, the most pure source you can get to your reference study. From there, if you can't find it in life, let's say there's a lighting condition you want to mimic, or some certain instance that you just can't study from, whether it's a quick movement of an animal, build a little maquette. Create a lighting situation for that. I've done that for numerous paintings. There's also a lot of great reference books on that. So the gentleman who did the Dinotopia series, he's an illustrator. His name's eluding me right now. But Google Dynatopia Illustrator, it'll come right up. He's got fantastic books, and this whole idea of building maquettes to understand light and form in a naturalistic way, and then build off of that with your creative inspiration. As we progress from, okay, we have a maquette, but we still can't get the nuances or stuff like that. From there, then we work to the idea of go out, take lots and lots of series of photos, take them in high intent or high exposure, underexposed, different lighting conditions, so you can see how that form, especially on living creatures, how that form interacts. What are the muscles below that form? You know, different lighting conditions are going to reveal those situations. And after that, if you can't find photographic resources to be able to, you know, like take your own photos, see if there's any on the internet. There's nothing wrong with that, except if you do that, you got to make sure that you're only using them as a bit of a resource, not an exact copy or anything like that, because we get into copyright laws. You know, you're going to essentially rip somebody else's hard work off if they're a professional photographer or something like that. So you have to be careful if you do use somebody else's photographic reference and it's kind of a solid copy of that photograph. But the thing about the reason why I put that one on the last pedestal of that waterfall effect of from life to the less direct sources is that when you work from life, you're going to make these unknown mistakes, these little instances of just kind of fun in the painting that work themselves out. And if you stick only to a photograph, you're going to be so locked into that photograph that a lot of times students or artists early in their careers, they don't know how to break from that to inject their own artistry. So work from life, let it trickle down from there, see where that takes you. Alright, so like I mentioned before, I'm going to start with a koi demo. I'm looking this as more of just a, you know, form color theory study. I've spent God knows how many hours at this point staring at koi and the natural properties of water and all this. So sometimes what I like to do is just jump into something and not really have a game plan and see where that takes me, because it's about making mistakes, and those mistakes, hopefully this one turns out okay. If it doesn't, that's okay too, because I'm probably going to learn something or make some mistake that's going to influence an idea for later on that is unknown right now. But you know, really I'm just using this as an example for working the materials and their applications. So nothing overly complex on my end. When I start with a pastel, what I like to do is lay stuff in with a pastel pencil. I've just found that it doesn't put much pastel down on the paper because pastel pencils are a harder, almost more chalk-like substance. And with that, it helps you find form and placement. So when we think about drawing, and going back to that substrate, drawing, when we think about outlines, outlines don't define composition or form. What outlines do is they define placement on the page, and that's all I'm after with this. I want to think about placement and form. So with something like this, also I like to start with really, really prismatic bright colors with what I'm doing for the outline placements. And what that allows me to do is have some of that warmth or that intensity pop from below, because pastels, they build like a structural quality. Sometimes you're going to be able to see that underlying surface peeking through from the bottom. And that also brings us to the idea of a toned ground. As you work, you're going to find that certain colors, certain tone grounds really work for you. So what I'm envisioning for this is maybe like a orange and white speckled koi on this much more neutrally kind of grayish, greenish background with some reflective qualities to it of the water. And so this warmth and this yellow pop, I'm going to use it as a unifier throughout the whole image. I'm going to try to want to leave some of this poking through in instances and not just take it all away. Other people, what they like to do is use either a dark background to get a lot of pop with like really, really bright, intense colors, or even something as simple as a white background to make sure that if they work in thin layers with pastel, when that light enters, it hits the whiteboard and it passes back out of the pastel, just like no different than what a glazing would be in an oil painting, but the difference is that it only works with really, really thin pastel colors, pastel layers, I should say. So using a tone ground coming through the painting. That idea of know your subject, know your form. If you don't, you're never going to be able to just wing it. And even when you do know and experience that form, what's going to happen is you're going to know it to such a deep level that you are going to be able to flesh in its details without even thinking about it. Part of drawing, part of the arts is about knowing form to an even higher degree than what something like a photograph would show, because you want to accentuate like if it's human body, you want to accentuate the musculature in certain areas, or bring out the definition of that form higher than a normal instance. So know that subject inside and out. And like I said, I've worked with koi forever, so I've got their forms down pretty pat at this point. What I'm thinking about is, just what's like a quick movement that koi could do. I'm looking at creating the structural underpinnings of this. So I've got, if I think about drawing through that form, I can think of the koi as a cylinder or a series of cylinders connecting, how that top ridge line of the koi is going to denote the movement in the water. And I'm just going to build it out and see where it takes me. So with koi, they've got kind of like this block-like form on their foreheads, or they don't have foreheads, their facial area. And what happens is, I know the protrusion points, in that there's going to be kind of this ring of an eyeball sticking out, and that is going to then lead into the nostril area, and then there off the nostril there is a slight flock out that is going to then wrap and take them into their little feelers. Apparently, I don't know all the technical terms of koi anatomy. I should probably figure that out, I suppose. But I know the form really well, and that's all I'm trying to get across. So it's going to have its little mouth going on there. You're probably going to see one break and a second gill off of that. That's when we're going to see that top surface come through. See the ridge line. There are gills from the angle we're looking at. We are going to probably see some gill movement through there. We might see the peak of that, or fin through there. I think about 2 head lengths back is normally when their top fin, God, I really got to figure out the names of these things. Their top fin starts on their bodies. That's probably going to be influenced by a rippling motion inside the water, so there's going to be sort of a pullback of it, and then we might see the underside of that. Off that, that's when their middle fins start. We can normally see those peeking out there. I don't think we'd see one from this side. If we draw through this thing, if there's one point, that's a midline, that's probably here. And so no, we wouldn't see that fin happening. And then if that movement's pushing us that way, they've got another fin back here, but we probably won't see much of it on this side because it's probably going to be pushing in the water back over here or something like that. And then if we think about the tail is probably going to be splashing around in that circle. It looks like that's coming up well enough on the camera. Sorry, I don't have 2 cameras right now, it's just the one. Maybe in future videos I'll get to that point, but we'll see how this one goes. So I've got my center line, I'm drawing through the form, I've got a structural quality to it locked in, and you can see that this is defining placement like I was talking about. It's not defining compositional structures or color theory or anything like that. And then maybe I want to think about how that water is going to move. I'll draw little arrows on it, so maybe there's a direction like that. Maybe this top fin's going to break the water. That forms a little vortex spinning this way. And if that water has a vortex, well, that thin area is probably going to have like broken areas inside of it because of that distorted quality of the reflection or refraction inside the water. So that koi might kind of break and disappear and distort as the dark water penetrates into the form and then the color of the koi penetrates outwards. I'm going to think about the lighting quality inside of this thing. I'll make my life easy and just imagine that light. It's like high noon, it's really bright, and that light is coming down in the form. And now, since I've got a structural drawing, when I say structural drawing, I mean looking through the form, defining its main interior masses through outline. One thing I like to tell my students is that if you can draw a box and understand the perspectives of drawing boxes, you can literally draw anything, because if you think about forms in general, like a classic life drawing technique, you build and truncate the body into different boxes. The head's a box, the body, the torso, the hips, and then how do those boxes align to each other? No different with anything you do. If you can draw a box, you can draw anything. So, I've got this main form. Also, you're going to notice this board's a little bit dirty. It's got some pastel dust on it. This was a whole board. I did another little drawing, painting on that half, and some of that pastel dust carried over. It's okay, because I'm going to put more pastel on this thing. Okay. So at this point, I don't want to go too much time, too much emphasis inside of here. For the sake of you guys, what I will do is I'll go back and I'll make the main forms just a little bit heavier in case they're not coming through with the spacing I've got away from the camera. Just to help you see that form. Now, one thing I've got to be careful about when working with a pastel pencil is that I don't want to press too hard, because what happens is, if you think about the structural quality of that sandpaper, it can decrease the tooth that it has, and then your pastel won't stick as well. So keeping the structural quality of the substrate alive is really important. So that was a water movement, so then maybe I'd see a little fin popping up through here. I've got my center line to understand that form. Got a peak, like a little mouth hanging out there, doing its little koi mouth thing. Alright, that's probably showing up well enough at that point. Okay, so from here, I'm going to drop the pastel pencil. I might pick these up later for detail, but probably not. Another thing what I'll do is sometimes I'll actually create a wet wash with pastel, which you can do depending on the substrate you're working. With pastel paper, it's a little bit heavier. It can handle a little bit of wetness. So what I'll do is I'll scrub in just a really light pastel dusting of whatever color I want. Wet the brush, don't get it too wet. Wipe it out. And then the trick with that is you just gotta wait for it to dry. And then you can go back into it, and it won't destroy the tooth of the paper. Alright, so from this point, what I want to start to think about is the actual mark of the pastel. So what you're going to find is that you can use this pastel in a variety of motions and a variety of manners. So often when people first start out, they think that, like, oh god, I got to have every little detail, every little stroke count perfectly where I want it. Whereas I take a more loose and rough approach to my preliminary work, in the sense that I'm not going to go too heavy or too dark, but I'm just going to look at this thing and just using the side of that pastel, really work some tone in. And what I'll probably do is I'll probably leave some of that board showing, and since this is only a study, it's going to have this beautiful unfinished quality to some of the exterior work, which can at times be even more beautiful than everything being buttoned up to the T, because it leaves space for the viewer to kind of insert themselves and see your mark and see your process, versus if everything's so beautifully rendered with every infinite detail that it can actually kind of push the viewer away, because what do they have to figure out in that drawing or that painting? It's all there. Leave something for the viewer. That's an important lesson. Alright, so I'm going to try to get this done in about 45 minutes. I might have to pause and restart the actual pastel. Okay, so just for the sake of what the camera memory can do. So from here, I'm going to look at it and say, alright, that's got some rough watercolor. It's a good medium tone level right now. I'm not going too light or too dark. And then from here, I'm thinking, I'm going to do an orange koi, so start to scrub in a little bit of orange. You can still see that underdrawing poking through. I want to think about, does this koi have any patterning though? So like, does it have beautiful like white, I don't know, rippling or dotting through its form? You're going to see that a lot within koi, and that's just kind of the beautiful nature to them, is they've got that patterning. So maybe I'll start to block out, it's got a little bit of movement there. Maybe it's got some lighter mass on its fins. Sure, we'll roll with that. Now as this koi moves through the water, I got to think about how the light's going to hit it. And so we'll probably have some heavier dark spots happening a little bit lower. And then we are probably going to have some darks happening around that body. So right now I've only used 2 or 3 colors. And with these colors, so I'm going to think about a light mass color and a dark mass color. So for this white, I'm going to have, a really, what I would perceive to be the white spotting the koi, really light pastel color, like a cream, and then I'm going to transition it to a darker cream as we move down. Whereas the orange of the koi, I'm going to transition it more into like a rust color as we move down. You're also going to find that there's variances inside of the pastels themselves. So with these Ludwigs, like this coppery burnt sienna color, it's super, super soft, and it rolls on there like butter. You're going to notice that I'm really loose. I'm all over the place. It's not infinitely tight systems inside of here just yet. Because again, I think you got to work with the subject matter, and for me the beauty of all this is that looseness and that freedom that I find within here. So I've got some primary colors laid in here, and then this is the part where I don't want to go too heavy just yet, and I want to think about these fun expressive pops of color, secondary colors that could enhance or play up the colors in the koi themselves. An area I like to do this is, let's say you have a break between light mass and shadow mass. Where that transition happens, you can normally pop in a tertiary color or a third color to liven up that form, and it's normally a very vibrant, intense color that's a little bit warmer, and it just happens especially in things like skin tone. So from here, I'm going to think about maybe, I'll go in with a more intense kind of pinkish structure. Liven those corners up. Now you're going to notice I'm using one color for the water right now, and what I can do with this is you can let that pastel become a blender to itself. So looking at this, what I want to think about is maybe that there is almost like a little bit of glow coming off this koi moving into the water, because that water, it's going to transmit the light bouncing off the koi. So maybe I'll go in with a hard orange through there, and then you can let pastels blend on themselves. You don't have to go in there and smudge your finger. Let the pastel do the work for you. So if I want to blend that orange down a little bit, I'm going to take that watercolor and just very gently work it over those edges, and what it's going to do is it's going to introduce some of the color of the environment and decrease the colors on that koi and work in accordance to them being influenced by their environment. Because as you get deeper in the water, that deep water, it's going to cause the form to soften and gradate a little bit, versus where it's higher in the water. Think about it like atmospheric haze. that's not going to cause a lot of interaction within the colors of the koi. So from here, I'm going to go back into the oranges. Think about where that catch light is going to happen on top of that koi as we move through. Okay, let's see here. Maybe there's a little bit on this fin, and I'm staying fairly light so I can still see that structural drawing popping through here and there. It's not completely wiped out. Now, I forgot about my light mass and that speckling, the patterning of the koi. So I'm going to go back in and just kind of add some spots inside of here. So we're going to transition into the shadows. Okay. I don't like how far that belly, that koi is inside of here, so I'm going to tighten that line back up. And then this pastel is so soft that I'm actually probably going to trade it out for something that is just a little bit harder. And maybe not quite as dark just yet. I'll leave it sitting out though. So I'll maybe go with just a little bit lighter red inside of there for right now. So we got that pectoral fin transitioning with the light source hitting it. I'm getting forms established at this point. And you're going to see that I'm constantly pushing and pulling. I'm okay letting an edge dissipate in space for the sake of finding some kind of, blurry, beautiful moments in there. If I try to overly constrain the drawing and not let it do its thing, it's going to feel too tight. So let that edge come and go. Find it, lose it, find it, lose it. It's all part of the process. So maybe I might start to tighten up in a few spots. Actually, what I'll do is maybe think about that water at this point. What's that water going to be doing to the form? Is it going to be pushing in on the edge work? Is it going to be distorting the form of that koi? Where is it breaking? So it might kind of push in here, cause some distortion. And then from there, we probably expect to see a little bit more intensive points happening as that water is going to project kind of sort of broken, intense patterning on top of that koi. All right. Now koi, typically they've got really dark eyes with kind of rims of bright intensity. So what I'll do is, again, I don't need a big palette to do this. I let the pastel blend through itself. So I'll put down that kind of watercolor, hit some red on top of it, work it back in, and just kind of push those colors to where they mud out a little bit and give me a certain amount of darkness. But it's going to be a prismatic darkness at that point. It won't be this really boring, just simplistic single color. So, all right, we got the eyeball starting to work there. That's fine. And then, I'm thinking, what can I do that's exciting within this frame? So, what are some other colors I could push? One color I don't have in my palette right now that's going to be useful. It's going to be a really, really light blue. I've got this like mid-tone blue, but there's a traditional system when you work with form, and what that's going to be is it's going to be intensely warm reflected light. So I'm going to see that underneath here. It's a little bit different in water because you don't have environmental reflections coming back, but you can find some warmth inside of there. Highlights are always going to be cooler than the mid-tone mass, so like a pop of a blue, just the color theory, it's going to actually add a little bit more dimension than if I left everything in the warm state. And I'm just going to work my way through this thing. So with this fin of the koi, I'm going to kind of think about that fin coming up on the top of the koi, and then, what's it going to do? It's probably going to have a certain movement and break out and around into that side. The tail, we're getting kind of lost in that watery mix at this point, so I'm going to leave that tail just really soft and broken, as if there's going to be some water ripples happening inside of there. And then I'm just going to blend by pulling through there. Now, there's other tools of blending. You can use a paintbrush to do really fine blending and transitioning. You can use something as simple as a piece of rolled up paper as a blending stump for just kind of smoothly doing things. I'll get there eventually on certain pastels, but for the most part, I let the pastel do the work for me. That gives you that excitement to the form. So I'm going to look at this and start to think about what could be some exciting color play I could get inside of here. So maybe underneath this shadow mix through here, I insert some green. That green is going to act as kind of a cooler shadow mass happening inside of there, and it's going to add an interesting break inside of the fish itself. As we transition to make things glow and have that glowing appearance, you want to start with a little bit more intense, high saturation, high chroma color, and it should lighten and cool as it gets to the center, and that'll give you almost like a neon effect. And so with koi, they've got these glowing parts to them under that water. So I'm going to have deep reds in the shadows, and then I'm going to transition to where, like, let's say that light is really beaming on the top surface of this koi, wherever those parts may be. Then I'm going to start to insert a brighter, more intense yellow, and that's going to allow me to get a bit of kind of like glowing effect eventually within the frame. Okay, so this is normally the part in a lecture or a demo where I ask for people to, field questions, or, just throw questions out at me, because otherwise I'm just randomly talking to myself and it gets kind of boring. So I will just keep talking to myself, I suppose. And if there's areas I don't like, that I'm not happy with, and I want a smoother transition, I'm just going to think about what color I want to pull through to blend and slightly influence those areas. So I want to keep everything really soft for this blocking phase. I want that water to feel like it's got, a soft quality on all the edge work, and nothing's overly defined at this point. Because if I define stuff too quickly, it will kill the life and the coloring inside of there. Alright, so let's say that this koi, we're going to get back into that patterning effect. That patterning is going to move across the koi. I'll transition into a more dark neutral variant to show that patterning still, that coloring still exists as it moves and it wraps through that form, but we're just getting into the shadow side of things. And if I want to darken it up even more, I can take some of that watercolor on the side of the pastel and just pull it through. Alright, so let's think about where this water is going to start to interact here. What happens when water pushes through and hits the koi, it actually creates a higher chroma area. It's just something about the refraction process within that water. I'm going to actually trade this yellow out. It's a little bit too intense for my liking right now. I'm going to go with something just a little bit less yellow and more of just like a buff colored yellow. That's just going to mix just a little bit better for me. Alright, so I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to make it look like that shadow is rolling through there. We're going to really get into some crazy transitions back here. So I can start to play with that water. pulling through. Now, you're also going to notice my hand really doesn't stop moving at any point within this process. I'm constantly just exploring form, finding form, moving what I have down. Part of that is simply because I'm doing a demo, and part of doing a demo is to move as fast as possible to give you guys as much information as possible. If I were doing this as something a little bit more refined, I might be going slightly slower, but keeping that intensity up at the beginning of a drawing is really, really important. It really sets the whole mood for what you're after within that artwork. If you want it to be a little bit more quiet and less energetic, you can absolutely do that. But again, it's going to be about more delicate, less energetic mark at that point, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so I want to think about how that nose is going to take light and how that light is going to transmit down the water. Now, that is a goofy looking nose on that fish right now, and that's okay, because again, I can take form, I can lose form, I can find form just by going in and blocking out edge work. Alright, so let's see here. I need to get that more defined to really show that that's the belly of the koi at that point. When the water's really rough, what you'll find is it pulls pretty hard inside that form, or not rough, but it's got a lot of surface distortions from the fact that the water's being churned up. So maybe we have kind of water distortions and ripples happening more towards the center area of that koi. Alright, and let's check that screen. You guys can probably see that coming together at this point. And this is when I start to kind of go a little bit heavier and layer into it a little bit harder. Maybe I will bring that yellow back. Bring it back. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, I'll bring that hard yellow back. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of push into certain areas just to liven it up a little bit. Thinking about where the surface planes are on that koi. How it's going to interact. Now, maybe over here, this is when I push, when I talked about the surface, or the interesting breaks of color, the variances you can get inside of here, this is when I start to really think about, like, oh, what would be interesting? What happens if I actually insert a heavy pink in this area of the frame? How would that interact with the lighting situation in the environment that I have set up? And it's one big, beautiful experiment. Because if all I did was just create a very naturalistic coloring and depiction of the koi with no secondary exploration or artistic input, it'd be kind of boring. And the whole point of being able to draw is to create these little worlds that you love, and you want to keep the systems matched in these little worlds. Like, to make it feel realistic and right, the lighting should feel consistent, the shadow work should feel consistent. It's really about a naturalistic depiction with an insertion of artistic nuance. So now I'm going to think about, well, what could be really interesting? Maybe in these really bright white coloring points, I'm actually going to start to insert little nodules of blue happening in there to liven up that color palette. And if this is that area where the fins start to break in the water, maybe they're a little bit rougher through there. I'm going to push some more orange on that edge and work it back down with watercolor. Maybe I need to define the edge of that koi head a little bit. You know, this could be a point where I pick back up a pastel pencil, and then you're going to find that with really soft pastels, the pastel pencil actually isn't going to put much pastel down, but what it'll do is it will allow you to have a point and kind of push and blend rather than lay down information. Maybe this koi has just a little reflection of blue happening around its eyeball to give it some variance and some break. And when you have these high colorization and insertion points, you got to think about the optical mixture that's going to happen. So if I've got like canary yellow and then I've got this kind of mid-tone blue, I'm going to get a green. So do I want that green, or do I want to try to keep those colors separate at that point? I'm okay with a little bit of green. I think it would be interesting optical mixture. What other colors could I throw in here to get the palette livened up a little bit? Maybe I could do like a muted purple. So at this point I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 12. I've only got like 12 colors. You don't really need a lot with pastels. That's the beauty of them. I want something a little bit more vibrant. Like I said, I really love vibrant colors for the koi. I think it works really well. So, because that vibrancy, again, the more you work these colors into each other, if you don't want them to stay quite as pristine, you just work some other vibrancies over top, and you get what I call a prismatic dark, versus just like if I were to take black and put it in here, it's a really dead color a lot of times. Keep your colors alive. Alright, so maybe we're getting some water distortions happening. I'll kind of kick out and draw out some intensities of orange moving out into the water, showing that that's the koi body, but that koi body is just sort of being distorted by this turned up water. And you can see that as I work, I'm constantly kind of moving back between the edge of my pastel, the side of my pastel, and just really letting that mark play. Like I look in here, it's probably a little bit too bright, so I'll take that down a little bit with some orange. I need to define the nose plane of this koi a little bit better. It's getting kind of funky on me right there, so I'll just take that orange and pull it completely through. Let it blend down a little bit, pull into the water. I'll go back with that watercolor, pull that down some. Then I'll start to go back in. It's like a mid-tone yellow. Think about that structure, that koi head. Because I know, I'll actually use my finger a little bit right there, that's fine. I know that koi head, it's probably going to have catches of light on the top area. And then those catches of light are going to transition it into its little tendril thing right there, which I should probably figure out the name of. From there, maybe we see just a peak of that bottom lip protrusion, bottom mouth protrusion. And what happens if I start to maybe insert a little bit of green through there? Like, does that work? Does that hinder it? I don't know. This is when I just play and I see what happens if we push maybe a little warmth inside that grayish neutral. Okay. And then maybe through here, what happens is if we have that white of that fin inside the shadow mass, or the light mass of the water, I'll just add a little bit more detail through there. That very well might kick some light back up on the koi. Heck, let's take some blue and drag it across there. See what happens. Because that blue could start to influence the idea of the top surface of the water. I want to draw it through the koi to where it looks like the colors are being influenced. You can see I'm just dragging that completely across. I'm letting those underlying colors kind of be just influenced by that play, that movement. All right, where'd my gray go? There it is. All right, so I'm gonna go back in. I'm gonna think about a few areas, maybe starting to tighten up on some areas. All right, I'm gonna hit that pretty hard for that fin right there. Blast a little bit of lightness coming back right there. That fin actually moved up on me a bit, so there it goes. I'm just gonna take it right out. Just gonna draw right back over it. And that's the thing, is that you should never have fear to let part of the drawing go. If that drawing is so precious that you're not willing to re-explore it or manipulate it, then it's probably gonna have a little bit more of a lifeless quality to it versus something that's really investigated and played with. So let there be a freedom to how you work. And now, the counter to that is, sure, you're going to get somewhere and it's going to feel right, and then, yeah, leave it. But if it's wrong, don't be afraid to go back in. All right, so I think I'm missing a fin down here. That's deeper in the water, so just kind of let that guy be really rough and really loose. Away from that guy. Okay, so we got our fin. And there might be a touch of lighter reflected light happening under here. Pushing on that koi, so I'll lighten that up. Give myself a little bit of dimension inside of there. Maybe around the ring of the koi's coloring, I'll do some really, really intense kind of warm transition points around it to accentuate the fact that that is like a different area of colorization within the koi. And it also acts as like that nice transition tertiary color pop idea, that when you have areas of different colorization and different mixtures, you insert brighter, more intense options. Alright, so I'm pushing that fin slowly but surely, a little bit more where I want it. Re-examining that guy. But it's constant push and pull, and push and pull, and push and pull. Just seeing what feels right. Also, as you work, and this is what I'm about to do, it's important to just step away from what you're looking at. I'm probably too close to the frame right now, so I'm gonna get away from it, stare at it from a different angle for a few minutes. See how that changes my perception of it. Maybe, I think that would work out well actually. I'll transition this white more into a blue as we move into the water column right there. And then, heck, maybe I'll even do something crazy. Maybe on the very bottom of it, I'll push it more into green, because the green's going to show as a warm. A warm against a cool is going to look like warm reflected light wrapping the bottom of that koi. So that could give me that dimensional wrap that I'm after. And now I can say, all right, well that's working, so I'm actually going to go back in and get a little bit more prismatic with those colors. I'm really going to push that pop inside of there. And my mark is a little bit sporadic. I'm not trying to overly constrain it. Maybe I'll drag some of that green down, let that water loosen up a bit. Alright, so I'm starting to get forms where I want them. I can grab that pastel pencil, think about adding a little bit of definition inside of there. That's just that red pastel pencil that I initially used for that block in. Alright, maybe I want the eye socket to have just a little bit more pop to it, so I'll take some orange, round that form out. Let's see here, where'd that pencil go? Oh, there it is. I think I need to bump that eyeball up just a little bit. There we go. That's looking good. I don't have any of my pure air purifiers running because I don't want it to distract from the sound quality. So bear with me on that end. Okay, I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to get away from it. I'm going to come back and look at it. Okay, took a break, stared at it with fresh eyes. Again, get away from your work. It's really important. And I noticed a few things. I need to tighten up that fin a little bit through here. I can get a little bit harder, a little darker with these transition points and the water qualities happening inside those ripple effect areas. So remember, when I got that water just churning, this is when that koi body can kind of dissolve a little bit. I can more so think about how those areas are going to reveal themselves through their distortions versus their actual form. So I'm going to let that tail be really loose and really solid, and then I'm gonna push some of that watercolor back and forth on this tail area to really demonstrate that that water is having an influence on the form, that it really dissipates and gradates down in the water column. So maybe there's a touch of orange on that. Maybe I'll use this kind of neutrally cream color as a blender. Alright, I think this green transition might need just a little bit more blue inside of there to where it makes more sense. I can soften it. Maybe I'll insert just a little bit of green on the lower chin right there. That could act as maybe that water spot, or the lighter spots in the koi, wrong color, transitioning through there. And maybe I'll influence that green with just a little bit of warm. Add some more red to that area, really accentuate that rollover of light mass on there. This is when I'm going to slow down a little bit versus that initial push on the drawing, because I want to really think about the form that I'm showing, how that form's wrapping in the water column. Is it working effectively? Do I need to change my attack method on it? I like to think of, it's kind of weird, but I like to think of the act of drawing as just kind of like this fight that you're constantly fighting. Maybe I'll make that fin a little bit more green down here. That's getting kind of interesting. Anyways, I digress. I like to think about drawing almost as kind of like a fight, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but regardless of the outcome, you're probably going to be a little bit better at fighting, no matter which way it goes, just from the experience. And then the more you draw, the more you do your thing, the more skilled you become, and you're going to fail a little bit less with every go. But again, failure is a good thing in a lot of senses, because it means that you're trying, you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And you're not playing it safe, and that's where inevitably, even if it doesn't seem like it at first, that's where good things come from, is the good fight. Alright, you can see how I'm adding those like really high intensity color pops on top of there, as if that's the water pushing through. This is where I could take that pastel pencil. I could get a little bit more specific on those pools. And really start to make it look like there is, really tight ripples of color transitions inside of there. Alright, and what's cool is that this is really starting to act as a, it feels like that koi is sitting below the surface, and that's what we're after. What I don't want is to do this and then it just feels like that koi is just kind of floating in a void with no plane shift. You got to give the viewer that information of what's causing this creature's world to exist. What are the environmental factors that bring that world to life. Alright, so like let's say out here there is actually kind of like a deeper ripple in that water mass. Well, maybe I take some red. This is when we get into that idea of the optical mixing, and then I influence that red with the watercolor, just to darken the watercolor a little bit, and add some areas of interest. And I think that blue streak is a little too much, so I'll pull that back through. Alright, I think all that's working pretty well. Maybe there are a little bit more surface distortions happening through this tail as that water mass is wrapping it below the surface. To make these feel like hard points, I need to pull in that watercolor a little bit more sporadically. Let that form really dissolve through here. You know, that watercolor is going to push in and outside of that fish. And yeah, I think for a little study, this is starting to go where I want it to. It's going to give me ideas to work with. Some of these ideas of like the influence of the blue to the green to that shift of white. I'll probably incorporate that to a higher degree inside of some paintings or more finished works. And that's how I view these things. It's just one grand experiment to help with something that's a little bit more intense and finished. But I can't stress that enough. Just when you're in your studio, you've got to experiment. You know, one thing I didn't lay out was a white. I'm gonna grab a white and then just do some kind of like highlight points inside of here, as if that water has a surface sheen quality to it. I'm just kind of dotting it as I go. Maybe there's some brighter reflected points on that koi. We got there's a brighter transition spot. Maybe one or two little pulls back there. I guess I probably need to lighten that up just a little bit for that to read right. Take that back down. Okay, I think we're just about in the home stretch with this guy. You're going to notice I'm constantly stepping back to evaluate what I'm doing. If I don't do that, I'm going to be too locked in to the form in front of me, and I'm not going to see areas that need improvement. And at this point, I've got that form set. I've got a traditional value system of highlights, midtone, shadows. There's not really super hardcore shadows in this. I could probably bring those transitionary periods up a little bit more. You know, the thing that happens with water that I found is that the water dissipates the intensity of the wrap of light versus dark, and so you do lose that core shadow to a degree versus what you would get on, you know, a normal lighting situation outside of water. Okay, maybe I need to pull that eyeball over just a little bit more. I think I should probably pull that down a little bit more because they've got really intense eye sockets like that. Okay. Where else can we add intensities? Do we need more intensities? I don't know. Maybe I'll add a little bit of red through there. Ah, heck, now maybe I'll go super bright pink. Super bright pink pops. That's kind of interesting. It livens that area up over there. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. You guys learned some things along the way. I certainly did. You know, you win some, you lose some. This one, I think it was a win. Raw. And just have fun. See where it takes you. That's the whole point of all this. All right. Have a good one.